C-21.
Senator Plett.
Well, colleagues, I don't think I'll be able to speak fast enough to beat the bell on this one, so we may have to do this in two shifts. But I rise today to speak on Bill C-21, an act to amend the Firearms Act and certain other acts. Colleagues, we have seen many bills pass through this chamber in the past 8 years. And if I'm being charitable, I think it is fair to say that a significant number of these bills have been beset by challenges. Some reflect a tendency we have seen in the current government to not think things through. Too often, such bills have not put the interests of all Canadians first. These bills have been highly political. In this regard, we are all familiar with bills like C-18, the Online News Act, which will come into force in just a few days. This bill is living up to all the shortcomings that witnesses who appeared before committee warned us about. Then, of course, we have had the range of criminal justice bills that the government has enacted, all of which were driven by an ideological soft-on-crime approach. Bills like C-5, C-75, and C-83, and they have contributed to the significant spike in crime, including violent crime, that we are seeing across Canada. These bills have not only failed to achieve their declared objective of enhancing public safety, they have actually undermined the ability of our police force and corrections officers to combat the control rising violent crime. And now we have Bill C-21. This bill is certainly one of the most divisive bills that the current government has ever imposed on Canadians. Like the other bills that I mentioned, the former minister claimed that Bill C-21 will contribute to the eradication of gun crime in Canada. To be sure, this is a bold claim, Senators, but it is a claim that the majority of witnesses who appeared before the Senate National Security and Defense Committee have already rejected. That is because this bill actually doesn't deal with gun crime at all. In fact, it completely ignores most gun crime. Instead, the bill targets legal firearms owners, individuals who in fact have always abided by the law. And in my remarks today, I want to discuss several issues related to this bill. First, I will discuss the total lack of consultation that the government has engaged in on this bill. This is the factor which I believe has contributed significantly to making this such a bad bill. Second, I will discuss what is a major focus in the bill, the purposed ban on the purchase and sale of legal handguns. I think it is clear that this measure will do nothing to reduce gun crime. Instead, it will only succeed in destroying competitive shooting sports in Canada for absolutely no benefit. And third, I want to discuss the expanded definition of prohibited firearms that is found in this bill. This is a measure that accomplishes nothing in the short term, but I think it reflects the government's long-term intention to do through regulation what it could not accomplish through legislation. These three issues lie at the heart of why this is an inherently bad and divisive bill for Canada. But if we are going to be honest, colleagues, I think we need to accept that this government actually intended this bill to be divisive. That is because they view this bill as a wedge for the Liberal Party in the next election. What they plan to do is use superficial messaging to sell this bill to people in urban Canada who will not fully understand what the legislation actually does and who the government hopes will buy the simplistic message that they are eradicating gun crime. But I do not believe they will be successful in this regard. They will not be successful because it will be readily transparent that there is no reduction in gun crime and that Bill C-21 has done nothing to move the needle. But that is what they will try to do. What the government is attempting to do with Bill C-21 is something similar to what another Liberal government tried to do 3 decades ago with a bill called C-68. In the mid-1990s, Bill C-68 established the infamous long gun registry. It was sold as a panacea that would solve many of Canada's problems with gun crime. Like all gun control bills before it, Bill C-68 was supposed to lessen gun crime by imposing yet more controls on lawful firearms owners. The problem was that Bill C-68's objectives proved to be completely unrealistic and unworkable. The long gun registry had been projected to cost just $2 million, but it actually ended up costing taxpayers $2 billion instead. But as Senator Gold always says, the government was serious about fixing this. And the registry itself had absolutely no impact on firearms crime. Because the legislation could not accomplish what the government claimed that it would do, public support for the bill evaporated. I believe the same will happen with Bill C-21. There is simply no chance that Bill C-21 can work as advertised because while the government claims it is addressing handgun crime, the bill actually contains no measures that will reduce the supply of illegal handguns that are being accessed by criminal gangs in Canada. Bill C-21 not only does nothing on illegal guns, but it does also not even reduce the number of legal firearms in circulation in Canada. Instead, the bill merely prohibits the approximately 650,000 Canadians who are legal handgun owners in Canada from selling their guns or buying new ones. This will have no impact on gun crime, but it gratuitously targets those 650,000 Canadians, making them the de facto scapegoats for a bigger societal problem. The government probably believes that targeting those 650,000 Canadians will be more manageable a number than the 2 million plus Canadians who were targeted by Bill C-68 in the 1990s. But in the end, Bill C-21 will be just as ineffective and just as divisive as Bill C-68 was. And in the end, Bill C-21 will meet exactly the same fate. I want to focus the first part of my remarks on explaining the major factor that has contributed to making Bill C-21 as bad as it is. The root of this lies in the total lack of consultation that the government engaged on this bill. When the current minister appeared before a committee on October 23rd, he claimed the following with respect to consultations, and he said, and I quote, "We engaged First Nations, Inuit, and Métis organizations, rural and northern communities, victims group, and with the firearms community and sports persons and sports shooters across Canada to hear their perspectives and to ensure that we respect their traditions and way of life. These consultations have informed our path forward." Yet soon after the minister made that claim, our committee began to hear from its first witnesses. Our very first witnesses were chief firearms officers from Alberta and Saskatchewan. One would think that if the government was drafting serious firearms legislation, the chief firearms officers in the provinces as a group would be ones with whom the government would consult. However, Dr. Terry Bryant, chief firearms officers for Alberta, responded in this way when asked about whether they had been consulted. Dr. Bryant said, and I quote, "I can answer that very quickly and save time. No consultation whatsoever." Again, no consultation whatsoever. Mr. Robert Freeberg, the chief firearms officer for Saskatchewan, said, Consultation was zero. Not a little bit, zero. The blunt nature of these answers led me to ask many of the other witnesses who appeared before the committee what consultations the government had with them before the bill was introduced. Gilbert White, chairperson for the Recreational Firearm Community of Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation, told us this. The Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation was not consulted. Eric Schroff, executive director of the Yukon Fish and Game Association, stated that his organization received a visit only after the government tabled amendments to the bill late last year. They were not consulted before that. When he appeared, the minister had claimed to us that, I don't think hunters or sports groups oppose this legislation. That's again a quote from the minister. I asked Mr. Schroff about that specific claim, and he responded that, on the contrary, I do not know of any sporting organizations that support this legislation. Gilbert White said the same thing, and I quote, from my perspective, we don't know of any hunters or organizations that support Bill C-21. Where does the minister get off saying these things? Mark Renault, president of the Federation of Quebec Anglers and Hunters, said, and I quote, in Quebec, our federation is not aware of any organization that supports this restrictive bill, from our sports shooters to our shooting clubs, our members, or our hunters. I asked Marcel Wilson, founder of the One-on-One movement in Toronto, are you aware of anyone within your community with which the government consulted before they introduced this bill? He responded, I would have to say no, not one. On November 6, Senator Deakin asked Sandra Honor, chair of the board of the Shooting Federation of Canada, were you and your group consulted? Did you have an opportunity for input or speaking? She responded, I quote, the Shooting Federation of Canada was not asked to participate in either the committee that discussed Bill C-21, nor did we have letters answered to us after we wrote the minister several times to request. When we then turned our questions to witnesses who appeared from various Indigenous organizations. Remember that the minister had specifically told us that, and I quote, we engaged with First Nations, Inuit, Métis organizations, and I don't think Indigenous peoples writ at large oppose this bill. But Chief Terry TJ of the Assembly of First Nations told our committee on November 6 that consultation with them was minimal or none at best. I would say not enough, certainly. That is why we passed a resolution last December. Chief Jessica Lazar of the Mohawk Council of Kanawaki was asked whether the government consulted her First Nation before the bill was introduced. She responded, no, we had one meeting, and that wasn't necessarily an adequate consultation, so I wouldn't consider it consultation whatsoever. Paul Erngot, Vice President of Nunavut, Tungavut, sorry about that, told us on November 8th, and I quote, neither the ITK or the NTI has been fully consulted on the language and impacts of the bill. Will David, Director of Legal Affairs of Taparit Kanatami, told us this. Put simply, there was none. The minister had reached out and offered, and we had reached out and requested, but that consultation never occurred. We're still waiting. Not a single representatives of the Indigenous organizations who appeared before us told us that they had been consulted before Bill C-21 was introduced, despite what the minister claimed, clearly said. Remember, this is the government that pushed for the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The minister told us at the time that adopting UNDRIP meant that going forward, the government would honor the principle of nothing about us without us. I asked Chief Terry TJ of the FNN what that pledge actually means if on a bill like this there is no consultations before the bill is introduced. The chief responded as follows. Well, clearly, that doesn't meet the standard that we want to adopt, especially with legislation that may have very adverse effects on our Indigenous peoples. Free, prior, and informed consent means that there would be proper consultation with First Nations. I would say even deeper consultations if that had any adverse effects on Indigenous peoples, especially with regard to our inherent rights. Colleagues, I do not see how one can come to any conclusion other than what the minister told us in committee was a complete and total falsehood. I remind senators again what he actually said, and again I quote, "We engaged with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis organizations, rural and northern communities, victims group, and with firearms community and sports persons and sports shooters across Canada to hear their perspectives and to ensure that we respect their traditions and way of life. These consultations have informed our path forward." I would submit on this basis alone, Bill C-21 should be rejected by this chamber. What the minister told us is not true. We need to ask whether there are any consequences when the government lies so blatantly. I certainly believe there should be consequences. But at a minimum, even if some believe that the bill itself should not be rejected for that reason alone, then at least the bill should have been amended to require consultations before it actually comes into force. Consultations are important on any bill dealing with a complex subject matter because it is always outside experts and stakeholders who know more than the government. We propose such a mandatory consultation amendment at committee. But of course, that proposal was rejected by the majority of the government-appointed senators. We then proposed another amendment that the government at least be required to consult with Indigenous peoples before enacting any regulations that flow from this bill. Such consultations would be required if regulations impacted the Section 35 rights of Indigenous peoples. But that amendment, too, was rejected by the majority of government senators, not only at committee, but also here in chamber in response to the amendment that Senator Boisvenu proposed. The only conclusion that one can draw from this is that not only do the principles of UNDRIP mean nothing for this government, that much is obvious, but in practical terms, they also mean very little for the majority of the government-appointed senators. Senator Lavikham Benson, who repeatedly reminds us that she is from Treaty 6 territory, tried to tell us this at committee, and I quote, "I believe very strongly in meaningful consultation." So do I. With Indigenous organizations. I sponsored the UNDRIP bill that was passed in 2021. Obviously, I fully support the idea of consultation, and the government is getting better at it. I would ask Senator Lavikham Benson, at what point will reality ever catch up with rhetoric? Or is the rhetoric all that really matters? I do want to acknowledge that at least two government-appointed senators did take their roles at our committee seriously. These were Senators Deakin and Anderson, and of course, Senator Richards. They disagreed with some of the amendments proposed, but I believe they did at least consider all the amendments seriously. On this issue of consultation, Senator Anderson in particular made an impassioned plea that future reviews should not take place behind closed doors. She was honest about what such cosmetic reviews had meant in the North in the past. She said, and I quote, "In regard to the review, I'm not confident of a review. We have reviews constantly in the North. Half the time, maybe more than half, we never hear back about those reviews. People don't even know there are reviews going on. That's problematic. We already know it's an issue. We have a responsibility as legislators to address that issue. We have the authority to do that. To fail to do that is to fail in the aspects of reconciliation. Section 35 Charter rights. It's unconscionable. I do not think an observation is sufficient. I think it's insufficient. I've been here for 5 years. There have been a lot of observations in regard to Indigenous issues. I can't honestly tell you one that I've ever seen acted upon. And that, I think, is what also concerns the many stakeholders who appeared before our committee. For all Indigenous hunting and sporting organizations who appeared before our committee, it is the government's track record on consultations which suggests they will also not be listened to in the regulatory process. The government has been very clear in stating that there will be regulatory processes arriving from this bill. That much we know. In the House of Commons late last year, the government was prevented from pursuing a broader firearms prohibition that would have specifically targeted hunters, including Indigenous hunters. This means that there is a serious potential for regulations that will be drafted behind closed doors that will target hunters. A number of witnesses expressed their concerns about this. Nathan Obid, the president of Inuit Haparit Kanatami, told our committee, "We have seen no government-wide implementation of the structures that we have tried to build with the Government of Canada on systematically upholding our rights and allowing for our participation in things such as legislative processes like regulations. Therefore, we have very little confidence that we would participate and be able to co-develop those regulations." Similarly, Tom Erngut, Vice President of Nunavut Tungavut, told us, "I really don't have a lot of confidence if it's passed very quickly as we've seen in the past. We need to be consulted on this Firearms Act just so that people are aware and can voice their concerns."
Sorry to interrupt you.